Next, I would like to invite Professor Arun Kumar to address the event. Hope Professor Arun Kumar and the next speaker, Mr. Venkatachalam, will explain more on the questions posed by the Honorable Finance Minister as well. Sir, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for inviting me. Honorable Finance Minister, Mr. Venkatachalam, and the other participants, it's an honor to be here. I have a PPT, so I'll present the PPT. I hope what I have prepared answers some of the questions that the Honorable Finance Minister has raised. So I'm also raising some of the issues that have come up before the public, and I've been writing on it for quite some time. I'll here be only presenting in brief what I have been saying, but there are these books of mine in which I have discussed the issue of disinvestment and privatization, the Indian economy since independence, which came out in 2013, and the economy's greatest crisis, the impact of coronavirus, which came out in 2020 December. So the point I'm making is that the current monetization program is linked to the wider philosophical underpinnings of policies and what is the vision of society that we have. So, whether we privatize or whether we keep the public sector is linked to the wider vision of society with which we are evolving. And what is clear is that, there has been a paradigm change in policies. So at the time of independence in 1947, due to the pressure of the national movement, it was accepted that individuals are not to blame for their problems, So whether it be poverty or illiteracy or ill health, it was accepted that the individual cannot solve the problem and we have to solve the problem collectively. An individual cannot set up a school, cannot set up a dispensary. It has to be done by the collectivity, and therefore the state was given a large role to solve the problem of all these basics of life. But in 1991, this was turned on its head and the paradigm change took place again. So of course, we had earlier in the 80s also some policy changes, but the paradigm shift came only in 1991. And now the paradigm shift was that the individual has to accept blame for the problems that the individual faces, and society is no more responsible for his problems. And therefore, if you want solution, you have to go to the market. So philosophically, this is what has changed, that there's now a process of marketization that underlies policies. So the view that comes out is that what kind of capitalism do we want? What is the current view of capitalism that the society and the state has? That is what is informing the current set of policies. Now, with regard to privatization, the historical development since 1991, we have tried disinvestment, we've tried privatization, we've tried the PPP, the public-private partnership mode, etc. And now we are talking about monetization of assets. But the monetization of assets is also, in a sense, the PPP mode, because here the ownership will lie with the government and the operations will be done by the private sector. So it's also like a PPP mode, but the PPP mode had not been successful and was more or less given up about 10 years back. The reason being that the government takes all the risks while the private parties make a profit. So this was the problem that was coming up with the PPP mode, and that's why it was given up. Now, we've also seen that massive privatization that took place in Russia after the collapse of Soviet Union. And there, in a sense, there was kleptocrats which emerged who got most of the public sector assets and they became billionaires very quickly. Privatization also implies strategic control that is passed on from the government to the private party. So even if the government is a shareholder in the company, the private party is actually the one that makes all the decisions. What has also been the history, for instance, in 1993, 94, 94, 95, we did the alternate budget for the country. And in that, we proposed alternate policies. And what we noted at that time was that out of the 137 centrally owned public sector units, 35 did not have top management, did not have chairpersons, did not have managing directors, and they were going sick as a result of that. Which is also true for the private sector. If the private sector also doesn't have top management, then it would tend to go sick. We also found that there was crony capitalism at play that was already taking place at that time. And, for instance, to give an example, NPCC was an organization that I looked at closely, and I found that its entire losses were because it was made to set up a railway line in Iraq for which it never got payment, and therefore the losses kept mounting, interest kept mounting in it. And there are many other such examples that could be given from that time. So basically the issue that we were flagging at that point of time in 93, 94, 94, 95 was that the public sector lacked autonomy, and there was massive political and bureaucratic control, and that led to the milking of the public sector for private profit. You have many cases in which the public sector lost out because the individuals in charge were making private profits out of it. The role of public sector in India needs to be appreciated because in a poor country like India, there's widespread market failure. You know, unlike in the advanced countries, there also there's market failure, but the market failure is much greater because the poor are unable to afford, you know, many of the services that the private sector may provide. So the role of the public sector became very critical. In 1947, at the time of independence, it was already appreciated that the private sector lacked the capital, you know, and therefore in 1944, the Bombay Plan came, in which Birla and many other top industrialists were a partner. And this was called the Frank Thakurdas report because it was written by Frank Thakurdas. And there the private sector admitted that we don't have the capital to set up the infrastructure for the country and for the development of the private sector. So a large public sector program in the infrastructure sector was proposed as a result of this shortage of capital with the private sector. Now, again, the lesson from the pandemic is that we are a collectivity. The public sector came forward to help the country, and therefore the importance of the public sector again has got highlighted in the pandemic. We very often compare the profits of private sector and public sector, but what we don't do is we don't take into account the social obligations of the public sector. It has to be an ideal employer. You know, it has to give labor the full play that labor deserves, which is not to say that there are not inefficiencies, which is not to say that there's no corruption, which I referred to earlier. Those are also there, but the social obligations of the public sector are also very clear. The question is that when we do privatization, will the private sector also follow the social obligations? Now, it's quite clear that to make a profit very quickly, one can make additional profit if one cuts employment and if one, you know, changes the technology that is being used. Technology was another issue that the public sector had to face because the country was trying to be self-sufficient, and therefore technology, wherever it was available, was obtained. So to make extra profit, one can change technology, one can cut employment, and we can raise prices, and that, you know, can be a quick route. But that also means that the social obligations will not be followed. So in a poor nation, will the private sector be able to cater to the needs of the poor? That becomes an issue that we need to worry about. So now coming to asset monetization, what are the questions that are being raised in the context of asset monetization? If you look at the document that was released, it says that it is a lease or a divestment of rights over existing assets. So the assets are being leased out, or divestment of the rights over the existing assets. This is what is being done. And it is said that this mandates detailed due diligence, legal and contractual agreements that clearly set forth the risks, rewards, and obligations of various participants. In other words, proper you know, legal framework has to be created, due diligence has to be done for this kind of a system. It is also said that the leasing out is of brownfield assets which are lying idle, so that the private sector which comes into the asset monetization scheme, they don't have to construct anything. They don't have to therefore get clearances, etc., which usually delay the situation. It's also said that these are assets which are working at low efficiency and where the capacity utilization is low, so that they're not generating the profits that they could otherwise generate. The question is that given the present situation, will the private sector be able to change this? In other words, will the private sector be able to raise efficiency? Will it be able to make the assets better utilization, etc.? So the question is that in today's economic situation where we are running into a downturn, the economy is still not back to 2019. In the Q1 of 2021-22, the GDP was still 9% less than what it was in 2019. And if you add about 8% more, which would have been the expansion of the economy if the pandemic had not hit, we are down about 17% compared to what it was. And therefore, large parts of the private sector assets are also underutilized. Capacity utilization in January 2021, according to RBI, was only 63%. So in other words, it's not as if the private sector assets utilization was also much better than what it was in the public sector assets. And this has to do with the downturn in the economy. So, in a downturn, we cannot say that because the assets are not being properly utilized, therefore privatization would necessarily help out. It all depends on the kind of demand that can be generated in the economy. The government also said to be short of resources, and they're saying that this is the way to raise resources. But again, the issue is that if we have 110 lakh crore pipeline of investments, then how would 6 lakh crore raised over the next 5 years help in fulfilling that? We need a lot more resources. And the question is, where can the resources be obtained from? Especially in the first quarter, because the tax buoyancy has been high. As far as the central government is concerned, the finance minister said that the tax collection rose by 74% and was higher than what it was in 2019 also. So in that context, will this 1.5 lakh crores or 88,000 crores this year and 1.5 lakh crores next year, was that necessary? There's also the issue that will foreign capital come in, because one of the things that is being said is that maybe foreign capital will also come in and participate in this program. But if that is the case, then what about the Atmanirbhar plan? The Atmanirbhar plan seems to imply that we would do most of the things on our own rather than depend on foreign capital. So in other words, there are several kinds of contradictions that appear in the program that has been proposed. Now, the assets to be monetized, this is the list of different kinds of assets that are likely to be, that are likely to go for asset monetization. The question is, which of these are underutilized and why are they underutilized? We need to analyze that. Why are these assets underutilized? One can understand maybe sports stadiums are underutilized because at this point, we're not having sports, etc. But then that's not the problem as far as the public sector is concerned. That could have to do much more with other factors, etc. If telecom towers are underutilized, the question is that in a situation where the line drops very quickly, why are telecom towers underutilized at this point of time? Or if railway tracks are underutilized, why are railway tracks underutilized, especially given that we have shortage of transportation in the country? So, these are very specific things for which we need to understand what is going on, why these assets could not be utilized under public sector. Was it a fault of the public sector, or was it the fault of something else? And, can we correct for those? So in other words, will the private sector be able to run some of these assets well or better if the government could not do it? Are the factors for underutilization different for the private sector as compared to the government? That is something that is not very clear at the moment. Now, what will happen as a result of this asset monetization? What appears to be the case is that there's going to be a concentration of economic power. So economy is at a low, and therefore the return on capital will also be low because the utilization is low, the income stream will be less, and then you actually monetize the asset by discounting, then you'll arrive at a low value. And this is where crony capitalism will come into play. And what will happen is that leasing out can be at prices much below what the worth of those assets may be. And that is what is going to result in concentration of ownership. The fear is that already there are some favorites of the government who managed to acquire a dominant position in airports, in ports, in power, in other assets, and that might happen further. There's always a feeling, or rather, it was said a few years back that India needs to create very large monopolies so that it can be globally competitive. Now, these monopolies and oligopolies that are likely to be created or strengthened, what kind of social and political impact they will have on the society, that needs to be also taken care of. It's not simply an economic question. Now, when you have monopolies and oligopolies, then the pricing becomes an issue. So you need regulation. Now, regulators are required, therefore, before you do asset monetization. And the question is that in many sectors, these regulators are not in play at the moment. So without that, if you go in for asset monetization, it may actually create several kinds of problems. Regulators have also been manipulated politically in India to fix prices and that can continue. So regulation itself doesn't necessarily fully solve the problem. We've seen that there's a possibility of gold plating of assets, or even at times asset stripping. And these can result in several kinds of problems for the consumer. So there's no guarantee of a fair price, even with a regulator. But at least at a minimum, you need to have regulation of the sectors where you're going in for asset monetization. Also, the contracts have to be drawn up as the original document itself suggests, that for leasing out, you need to draw fair contracts. But there's no guarantee of fairness if there's a crony capitalism that prevails in the context. Now, this asset monetization policy is a part of the overall policy framework of the government of India, which is what is called supply side policies. And these supply side policies are supposed to boost businesses by enabling them to generate a higher profit. So if the idea is that if you have higher profitability, then there'll be more investment. But the question is that it's not necessary that you'll have higher profitability. It's not necessary that more investment will come in, because in the new investment that will come in, net, there'll be no gain. Why is that? Because the government is selling or giving out on lease its assets. So it's lowering its capital and then using that money to invest in others. So net, the government doesn't increase investment. And the private sector which comes in to take these assets, that also is going to divert funds from somewhere else to invest in this. So in net, there'll be neither increased investments in the private sector nor in the public sector. So the overall requirement of the economy that you increase capital investments, that is not likely to be fulfilled by this kind of policy that is there. So it's basically a transfer of assets rather than a net addition of investment in the economy. Now, also, it's very clear that to boost private investment in the economy, you need to generate demand. And it's demand that is a problem. And as RBI's survey pointed out in January 2021, that the consumer confidence, and mind you, this survey is of the organized sector, not on the unorganized sector. The organized sector survey points to that the consumer confidence is down to 55.5, whereas in January 2020, it was 105. And then in the second wave, the consumer confidence went down further, and the consumer confidence of the middle classes also fell because of the huge medical expenses that large number of families had to fulfill. So the point is that supply side will not be able to deliver when demand is short. So all these policies that are being pushed through by the government, in which they're hoping that the investment would revive because the investment had fallen drastically in the first wave and in the second wave, that is unlikely to be fulfilled by supply side policies. What you require a demand side policy. The point also is that banks are flush with funds. There are about 8 to 10 lakh crores that the banks have, which the private sector is not able to get. A, because they're not investing enough, and B, because there's a problem that the banks face, that there could be increase in NPAs. The stock market is booming, and therefore the private sector can borrow from there and acquire public sectors cheap. And that's how the cronies can get assets cheap. So the question is, what kind of capitalism do we want? Do we want competitive capitalism, or there is going to be monopoly power in economy? And with monopoly power, what kind of situation will arrive? And here I'd like to only quote what Warren Buffett and others have been saying for the last almost 10 years, when earlier in 2014, he said that for the survival of capitalism, we need to have more equity. He pointed out that his secretary was paying a higher rate of tax than he was paying. And that is because businesses and investors get a huge number of concessions and deductions. And he said that's not good for the health of the capitalism. And therefore, he said that the rich must pay higher taxes. And he was supported by the German rich, the Italian rich, and the French rich. And I asked at that time in an article in the Hindu, what about the Indian rich? But the Indian rich did not want to pay higher taxes. So in other words, even as far as monopoly creation is concerned, it is recognized that it is not necessarily a good thing for an economy, and especially for a poor economy like India. So what would be the impact on the people? The public sector was built out of public resources. So the question is, why sell them cheap at the present time when the income stream is much below what it could otherwise be? And these assets are giving some return, even if low return. And if the return continues, then the budget would continue to get some form of return. But if you privatize the assets, or if you monetize the assets at the moment, then the income stream in the future could get impacted, and that could then affect the public services program that needs to be taken up, especially in a poor country like India. So as I was saying earlier, once these assets are given out, it's easy to raise prices and therefore generate profit, and that will lead to inflation. And in a current situation where already the incomes are down, employment is down, inflation is likely to aggravate the slowdown in the economy. That would not be good for any of these asset monetization programs. To make a profit, they could also cut employment. And that, in a situation where unemployment is already high, would be a problem. That would also cause problem for reservations, because the public sector employment goes down, then reservation would also go down. So therefore, the help to the deprived sections, the positive program, the affirmative program, that could also get dented as a result. What we have also found is that high cost infrastructure creates a problem for a poor country like India, and that's why in the road sector, power sector, etc., large NPAs came up. When in the UPA regime, there was massive investment in these sectors by the private sector. Many of them turned NPAs and created problem for our banking system. So the high cost infrastructure is something that we have to worry about, whether we create a high cost infrastructure. And globally, of course, some privatization has been reversed, like in the British Rail. And in India itself, we found that the private sector trains which were attempted before the pandemic, they were not successful. And the reasons why they would not be successful, because high cost infrastructure created for generating profits may not actually be very profitable in the Indian context. So we have to think about the kind of infrastructure that would get created when we do asset monetization, what kind of problems will come up. Now, in conclusion, what I want to argue is that the collectivity needs strengthening. That's the lesson that we have obtained from the pandemic. With growing monopoly power, prices and inequality will rise. This is very clear. And the view of capitalism, whether competitive or oligopolistic, that is something that we have to also worry about, which would be better. And if it has to be competitive, then we have to worry about the crony capitalism that invariably comes into this kind of privatization and asset monetization that is being attempted. The social and political impact would be very clear. The monopolies and oligopolies dominate Indian scene today, where even media, etc., are under their thumb. So there will be a political impact. There will be also social impact of this, and that would weaken the accountability of our political system, as far as I can see. So what is the best way to raise resources? A question that the Honorable Finance Minister also asked. The best way to raise resources would be to generate it through direct taxes rather than through this sale of assets or through indirect taxes, which is the model that the government is following. And basically the way the government raised resources shows what its priorities are, what its inclinations are. And clearly the present government at the center, its priorities are to boost business confidence. And what I have been arguing is that that cannot be done without the generation of demand. Stock markets are booming, banks are flush with funds. So funds could be raised for investment from these sources, apart from the direct taxes that could be raised. Pandemic has also shown that the collectivity needs to be strengthened, because in the future, as President Biden has said, that we can continue to have more and more of these pandemics. The pandemic that has come, the coronavirus, is the 7th virus since the year 2000. We've had SARS, MERS, Ebola, H1N1, etc., etc. Ebola was deadly, but fortunately it was not as virulent. Now, if the next virus that comes is both virulent as well as deadly, then there's a possibility of another crisis that could come. So every 2-3 years, we are having new viruses that are coming. So we need a stronger public sector and not a weaker public sector. And the question is, can the public sector be reformed and made efficient? I don't see any fundamental problem in the public sector working efficiently and generating a profit. What we need is autonomy from political and bureaucratic control. If that can be assured, then the public sector can run profitably and contribute to society. Thank you very much for your patience.
So thank you so much for your extraordinary speech. I can't agree with you more. when you said how in a country like India, which has very high Gini index and very high inequality, how not doing enough for the poor could be detrimental to the economy. And also, I can't agree more when you say that government has not been doing enough to increase demand. Most of the things the government does is only to increase the supply side problem, but nothing to increase the demand side. And without increasing the demand, I think nothing much could be done.